Origin just reaction. This is Halloween special Werewolves for the channel only Sarcastic production. Yes, this was recently uploaded yesterday, I think. Obviously today's Halloween, so why the hell not? Only Sarcastic Productions Halloween specials are always awesome. I directed one or two of them. There's still some left, and they're always awesome. You know him, you love him, but you might not know him quite as well as you think you do. Today, let's dive into one of the big name creatures of the night. Okay, so werewolves, basically, as far as I know, first of all, werewolves are one of the most famous things that are, right? Whether it's TV shows, movies, or even games, werewolves are everywhere. Werewolves is, I think, concepts, as far as I can think, right? I'm guessing here, it probably started as a curse thing that just, somebody did something, somebody got cursed, and they become werewolves every time there's moon out or something like that. Beyond that, I don't know much. But obviously, this is gonna be fun. The Red is gonna go pretty deep into this one, like how far back the lore goes, which is going to be fun. Remember, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like, subscribe. Check out the reaction. There's a link in the description. Check out the cast for playlists like all Sarcastic Production reaction with all of my OSP reactions in there. And then John Sean, bottom of 40k, internet historian. And yeah, that's all this one.
Welcome back, one and all, to the spookiest season of the year. Crisp autumnal magic is in the air, the moon is bright, the wind is howling, and it's the perfect time to dive into one of the most iconic Halloween monsters, the werewolf. Somewhere in the shadowy liminal space between animal and human, while the werewolf is simple on paper, if we take a closer look, we find a surprisingly complicated mess of tropes and existential questions about the nature of humanity itself, all tangled up in an oddly flexible figure that's filled a lot of roles over time. Now, werewolves, like vampires, are broadly common knowledge in modern pop culture, but their specific mechanics vary a lot depending on who you ask and who's writing them. Werewolves have a lot of associated tropes, but not a lot of internal consistency, which makes it a little difficult for me to give a snappy one-line definition we can work off of. The one consistent through line is that werewolves are humans who sometimes transform into something like a wolf. Some versions of werewolves transform exclusively during the full moon, triggered by moonlight, while some can transform whenever they want, and some can choose to transform except on nights of the full moon when they're forced to. Some turn into mindless monsters, while others stay totally coherent and in control.
Yeah, so the word lunatic, basically that means that anytime somebody sees a full moon, they basically go berserk or something like that. There is a thing like that. That's where the word lunatic comes from. Lunatic. I just recently learned that, and I'm like, what the fuck? But then it word makes sense, I guess. So this werewolf and moonlight thing probably came from that, right? Like, okay, so somebody sees a full moon and they go crazy. Acts really volatile or something like that. So somebody just infused that into the werewolf thing. Like, they see full moon and they become a werewolf.
Turn into full-on wolves, while some take a hybrid humanoid form instead. Sometimes being a werewolf is a transmissible curse that functions like a bloodborne disease transmitted by bite, and sometimes it's hereditary or done by magic or artifacts. Sometimes werewolves are practically unkillable except with specific weaknesses like silver or wolfsbane, but sometimes a regular bullet will do the job. And that's not even touching on the low-calorie werewolf tropes that get used in broader media, like giving characters wolf-like traits like fangs and claws, enhanced senses, social pack dynamics, and certain NSFW qualities that form the backbone of an entire genre of erotica I regrettably now know exists. But we've seen this kind of inconsistency before. Frankly, it's much more common for pop culture staples like these to have lots of internal variation than for them to have some kind of rigid canon defining how everything works. Fittingly, for creatures of such fundamental transformation, the werewolf has changed a lot over time. Today, let's trace that evolution and explore how the modern werewolf gradually took form. Now, like I said, it's not exactly easy to nail down what should and shouldn't constitute a werewolf. If we work on the popular modern full moon and silver weakness version, there are no werewolves before 1940. And even if we try broadening it to person who turns into a wolf, technically there's only a handful of werewolves after 313 CE. So let's loosen the definition significantly and just start looking for anything that kinda looks like a person who turns into a wolf. We get a couple promising candidates in ancient Greece and Rome. In Herodotus' Histories, a record of local culture and history written back in the 400s BCE, Herodotus describes the Neuroi, a tribe he locates around northern Ukraine who supposedly transform into wolves for a few days every year before changing back. Virgil's eclogues around the turn of the millennium millennium feature a character named Morris who uses baneful herbs to turn himself into a wolf, and a few decades later we get another casual werewolf in Petronius's Satyricon, where a character recounts a nighttime journey he took with a soldier who he later discovered was a werewolf. The soldier snuck off on his own, stripped naked, peed in a circle around his clothes to turn them to stone, then transformed into a wolf and ran off to kill some sheep. Ovid's Metamorphoses, right around the aughts CE, recounts the tale of King Lycaon of Arcadia, who tests Zeus's omniscience by killing someone, either a hostage or his own son, and serving him for dinner. As punishment, Zeus transforms him into a wolf. That's all Ovid has to say about it, but we're gonna be hearing a lot more.
I feel like Zeus turned him into a wolf and then realized, oh wait a minute, he did all that shit. Zeus just turned him into a wolf because he liked to do that at that point, I guess.
About Lycaon from now on, and about 100 years later, Pausanias' descriptions of Greece featured a more detailed version of the story, wherein King Lycaon founds the city of Lycosura on the mountain Lycaeus, founds the Lycaean Games, and gives Zeus the new epithet Lycaeus, which, for translation, is basically King Wolf founds Wolf City on Wolf Mountain and starts the Wolf Games in honor of Wolf Zeus. Ah, Latin. Wonder what the twist is. Now, according to Pausanias, Lycaon was a contemporary of Cecrops, ancient mythical founder king of Athens, and that back in these days, humanity was kind of re-evaluating how to worship their gods. Cecrops had made the wise decision to pull back on the whole human sacrifice dealio, but Lycaon apparently decided to double down and honored Zeus Lycaeus by straight up killing a baby. Zeus didn't like that very much and turned Lycaon into a wolf as punishment. Pausanias thinks this is 100% believable and historical, but
yeah, I guess, killing the babies, hits really hard for Zeus, as somebody pointed out in one of the videos, because how Kronos ate Zeus and all his siblings, I guess. Not Zeus, but, Zeus's sibling, and, so they had to fight back. Wait a minute, did Kronos eat Zeus? I don't know, I'm getting confused here. But yeah, it's basically all siblings, Kronos ate, right? So that's why anytime, somebody kills a kid or something, I guess Olympians go crazy.
It expresses skepticism about a follow-up piece of folklore that attests that every year at the Lycaean Games, someone is transformed into a wolf, but transforms back if they avoid eating any people for the next 9 years. Pausanias thinks that's just silly, but that first wolf thing was totally real. He's not the only historian to be selectively skeptical. A few decades earlier, Pliny wrote his Natural Histories in an attempt to write down the entire body of human knowledge all in one place, and in it, he laid out a somewhat different werewolf setup, though this one is also supposedly set in Arcadia. Pliny says there's a tradition in Arcadia where a young man is chosen by lot to dump his clothes and swim across a swamp, at which point he'll transform into a wolf. He'll then spend 9 years as a wolf, and if he avoids eating any people in that time, he'll be able to swim back across the swamp to turn back. Pliny also mentions the whole Festival of Zeus Lycaeus thing and brings up an actual historical dude, Demanitus, who was supposedly transformed into a wolf at a sacrifice to Zeus Lycaeus, spent 9 years as a wolf, turned back, and went on to become an Olympic prize-winning boxer. Forget doping scandals. From now on, this is the only sports controversy I care about. Now, at this point, we've got some pretty—
Yeah, it is something, right? 9 years as a werewolf, and if you don't kill anybody, you can come back again. What is this? Like, somebody coming out of the prison, right? We are watching you, right? You behave or you'll go back to prison, something like that.
recurring themes. There's some variation, some of these werewolves are transforming at will or with the use of magic herbs, but most of these stories involve the transformation being some kind of divine punishment, usually from Zeus, and a very specific 9-year timeline of being stuck as a wolf before changing back in the 10th year, and only if the werewolf didn't hurt anyone, making the whole thing functionally a test of character. These werewolves also unilaterally turn into proper wolves, no wolf-man hybrids in sight. And that is pretty much the Roman consensus on werewolves until around 313 CE, when a funny thing happened. Emperor Constantine started to think this hot new Christianity thing was sounding pretty sweet and decided to pump the brakes on oppressing them and look into joining them instead. Now around 410 CE, another funny thing happens. Rome gets sacked by the Visigoths. This bums out the Romans in general, especially the Roman Christians, several of whom worry that this sudden spate of bad luck might be divine punishment for their conversion. Sensing unrest, Bishop Augustine of Hippos decided to assuage those fears by writing The City of God in 426, which surprisingly has a lot to say about werewolves. See, at the time, everyone kind of just believed werewolves existed. It was one of those common knowledge things. But believing in werewolves had been deemed unchristianly, since a werewolf was presumably not transformed by God and thus shouldn't be able to transform at all because that would require power that only God has. This is going to be a recurring problem for the burgeoning religion, and Augustine decides he's the man to tackle it. He brings
lots of lots of mythology basically get crossed because how religion and Christianity, only God can do things other entity can't. So anything that doesn't is just there because of some other reason, right, basically gets squashed because that can't be true if God's not involved. That is something. I mean, werewolves basically, it kind of feels like curse thing is a common theme here before it's used, right? And it was a common knowledge, So, imagine walking around that time, right? Like going to a time machine and walking around that time. Just general conversation with people. First of all, I don't even know how we talk to people. The language would be so fucking different. But still, just generally talking to people, right? I mean, their general knowledge would be so surreal to us. They would just talk about like werewolf, like, yeah, werewolf exists. Why not? There are werewolves. I mean, that would just feel so surreal.
Brings up several now familiar bits of werewolf lore: the Arcadian swamp, Demanitus the boxer, all that good stuff. Augustine admits that categorically denying these claims is kind of tricky because there are plenty of people who will swear on their lives that they either saw a werewolf, know someone who saw a werewolf, or even are a werewolf. Augustine thinks this is all pretty stupid and frankly impossible, but struggles to reconcile this with the fact that through God all things are possible, and the big man has a habit of working in mysterious ways. The implication is that a werewolf could exist, but only if God was cool with it. Augustine does think, however, that the idea of a human physically transforming into a wolf is impossible. What Augustine does think is possible is that a person could be put into a deep magical trance, their dream self could be extracted from their body, magically transformed into a wolf easily because it's just a dream, and then phantasmally projected out into the real world where other people can see it. I love a simple solution. Believe it or not, this hot take basically turned into the official church doctrine on how werewolves worked. They weren't actually werewolves.
See, the best thing about things like this is they always tackle this problem like it's like a math problem or something. In mathematics, something doesn't make sense. You, I guess, check, any formula that is known that works, and you just, trace your way from there, like fit in the gaps and, things like that. In this, basically, werewolves, that's stupid. But I mean, anything's possible under God, right? But werewolves not associated with God. So let's try to fit in the story, like where God could be the reason werewolf exists, and they just create this shit. Right? And they just think, yeah, that makes sense, so that must be true. It's like a math problem or something. That's ridiculous.
Werewolves, they were just hallucinating so hard that everyone else started hallucinating too. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, the official Christian stance on werewolves didn't actually matter all that much to most people, even after the broader Christianization of Europe. Plenty of the werewolf literature from this era has almost nothing to do with whether believing in werewolves is technically heresy or not. For instance, in 1188 CE, Archdeacon Gerald of Wales writes the Topographica Hibernica, an account of the landscape of Ireland that includes an anecdote about a priest who encounters a wolf in Ossory who can speak and tells him he's really a human and that his people were cursed for disrespecting a saint, so that every 7 years, 2 of them have to take the form of wolves for the next 7 years, changing back if they manage to survive. He asks the priest to help his companion, a sick she-wolf who wants to be given her last rites before she dies. The priest reluctantly obliges, and the author contemplates the ethics of the whole situation, bringing up Augustine's assessment of the whole transformation versus illusion dilemma, and concluding that God could totally make a werewolf in the same way he could make Lot's wife into a pillar of salt or water into wine. Gerald briefly considers where transubstantiation fits into this and decides it's probably safest not to touch that particular theological mess, which is honestly hilarious. On a similar note, the Norwegian text King's Mirror in 1250 tells that when St. Patrick came to Ireland to try and convert the locals, he was met with particularly ferocious opposition from one clan in particular, who drowned out his sermons by howling like wolves. Angered, St. Patrick prayed for God to punish them, and apparently the big man decided to approve the werewolf thing just this once, because the clan is cursed to turn into man-eating wolves every 7 years. Both of these stories seem to tie into the werewolves of Ossory, a supposed lineage of people descended from Leinek Felav. Leinek Felav.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's about right.
Guys, I'm really sorry. I looked up how to pronounce this, and there is literally no pronunciation guide for this anywhere on the internet. Normally, there's something, but Leinek Felav is the one guy who's got no pronunciation guide online. Okay, he's described in The Fitness of Names as a man who could turn himself into a wolf and would go hunting with his family, and he later produced a whole line of people who could turn into wolves whenever they wanted. It's interesting to note that the Irish text about this frames the transformation as voluntary, while the Welsh and Norwegian versions make it a curse as punishment for defying the Christian God. Now at this point, werewolf lore has shifted a bit. The classic version, person who can turn into wolf, still exists, but because of Christianity's fundamental beef with the base concept, wherever those werewolf stories bump up against the spread of Christianity, they get reworked to fit. In this model, werewolves can only exist as illusions or divine punishments. The 10 to 1200s breaks this rule with a few explicitly heroic werewolves, most of which follow one plot structure. The anonymous Breton Lay of Melian and the poem Bisclevret, written by Marie de France, both pop up in the 11th century and describe a heroic warrior and friend of the king who is secretly able to transform into a wolf, but can only change back if he has access to his clothes or a magical artifact. His wife learns of this, traps him in wolf form, and runs off with another man. The werewolf, stuck as a wolf, eventually finds his king, who finds this mysteriously tamed name Wolf strangely endearing and
Trapped in a wolf that runs away with another man. And the wolf is in the distance is watching like, bitch.
fiercely loyal, so the wolf becomes the king's constant companion until he eventually encounters his wife and her new husband, attacking them and forcing them to confess the truth to the king. The werewolf is restored to human form and everyone winds up happy. In Beast Gevaudan, the werewolf is just some cool baron guy, but in the Lay of Melian, the werewolf is an Arthurian knight and the king is King Arthur. Another French poem from this era, Guillaume de Palerme, I'm also saying that wrong, features a similar werewolf in a supporting role. He's been trapped in wolf form by his stepmother and helps the heroes, who in turn help him win back his kingdom and get him changed back. Now, werewolves are broadly notably absent from most Norse and Scandinavian literature, unless you kind of stretch the definition of werewolf to include person who wears a wolf pelt and acts like a wolf without actually transforming, but there's a pretty classic werewolf story buried in the 13th century Volsunga saga where two characters find enchanted wolf skins that turn them into wolves until they manage to remove them. The werewolves in this era strike an odd balance. It's not consistent whether or not their transformation is a curse, even in the space of a single story. These werewolves often initially transform willingly, but are then trapped and can't freely change back. They're all intelligent, and several are surprisingly heroic, although Melian does kill a bunch of people while he's a wolf, so it's not like they're strictly unproblematic. At least
Okay, first of all, isn't werewolf just means a human that is now a wolf, or a type of wolf or something like that? So doesn't this, your current werewolves that we know of, like the first one was in current 1940s, the current version, where it's a hybrid of human and wolf. I think that's what a real werewolf should be, right? A hybrid of that. If a guy just basically transforms into a wolf, is that a werewolf? Or is that the magic turn into a wolf? I don't know. Werewolf should be the hybrid of two things, not just transformation into a wolf.
In Britain and France, being a werewolf seems to just be a thing that some people are, a surprisingly neutral and even positive framing for such a generally loaded concept. But unfortunately, the fun times screeched to a halt in the late 1400s. The problem is, while it might have been the official church doctrine that werewolves were ultimately mostly fictional and or harmlessly delusional, the actual beliefs people generally held got a little bit contradictory. Since the root doctrine was the idea that it was impossible for people to derive real power from pagan sources because capital G God was the only real God, it followed that it was heretical to believe that anything pagan could have real magic behind it. In 785, the Council of Paderborn made it actually illegal to accuse anyone of witchcraft because good Christians didn't believe in witchcraft. This changed at the end of the medieval period, where witchcraft was recharacterized as a form of heresy and thus both dangerous and deserving of capital punishment, which was really catalyzed in 1486 with the publishing of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum. You may have heard of this book as the Hammer of Witches, almost single-handedly responsible for kicking off the witch hunts and, by extension, the brutal and tortuous deaths of something like 30,000 innocent women conservatively and something on the order of 10,000 innocent men. And you might have entertained the idea that the dude who wrote it maybe didn't have the healthiest attitude towards women overall, and you would not believe how right you were. To make a very long story short, the year is 1485, the place is Innsbruck, Austria.
Yeah, power of paper and pen is just ridiculous. Somebody writes something and thousands of people die. Ugh.
And newly arrived churchman Heinrich Kramer is already having some serious problems with Helena Schuberin, a local woman known for having opinions and being unafraid to share them, which is always a dangerous combination. Helena is deeply unimpressed with Kramer, calling him a bad monk and in league with the devil, and refusing to go to his sermons because of his absolutely rancid vibes. Kramer responds by putting her on trial for witchcraft. Helena is found innocent, in large part because Kramer is obviously obsessed with her, and the bishop ends up calling him out for his wildly unfounded claims and tells him to back off. Helena moves on with her life, and Kramer does not, haunting the city for the following year, investigating witches and stalking Helena until the bishop finally kicks him out. Kramer
Alright, here's what I'm thinking. Every time somebody just, claims somebody's a witch and just asks to, burn her or something like that, right? And then they come to realization or come to a decision that she's not a witch. And somebody still persists that, she's a witch, burn them. How do you just let that go? Like, somebody just literally asked some other citizen to be burned and killed. I mean, how something like that doesn't have repercussions or something like that? Because if, understand that he thought she's a witch, and around that time witch is a real thing, that's what people thought, and all that shit, fine. But once somebody's like, okay, she's not a witch, and somebody still persists that burn her, she's still a witch, doesn't that, like, malicious intent type of thing? You just let that thing go? I don't know.
responds by writing The Malleus Maleficarum, a book about how women are super incredibly evil and in league with the devil and need to be tortured and killed about it as quickly as possible. Judge Claude Frollo wishes he had what this guy had. The text was described by contemporary theologians as unethical, illegal, and actively heretical, but it was unfortunately very influential on account of being 98% fear-mongering by volume, which has a very high success rate at convincing people to do terrible things. Despite the controversy of the text within the church and the fact that from the moment it was published, people realized it was going to hurt a lot of innocent people, Kramer still managed to sway public opinion and stoke terror that witches were very real and very powerful and had to be stopped at any cost, especially if that cost was torturing and killing a lot of women. Man, I am just so disappointed to learn that the inventor of the witch hunt was a terrible person. It's just every time, you know? Do you guys think we could separate the art from the artist? Now, while the witch hunt era...
Yeah, man, witches are completely real. These are all witches. It's not like I have some small dick. No, witches are real. It's not me, it's them. Witches are definitely real, and I do not have a small dick. That's what that was.
was mostly fixated on witches, werewolves came up too, although not as much as you might expect. While witches were consistently considered very real problems worth murdering about, the through line still seemed to be that werewolves were a bridge too far, and were probably just being deluded by the devil into thinking they were wolves, and were at most simply covered in the illusion of a wolf. Still, there was some argument about this. Many contemporary texts and sermons back up the delusion and illusion version, but others say that werewolves could transform through a potion or a trinket given to them by the devil himself, which was similar to how they believed witches could supposedly fly. Around this time, werewolf was also being used as a synonym for serial killer. In 1589, German farmer Peter Stubb was tried for murder, cannibalism, incest, and a whole bunch of other stuff broadly under the umbrella of being an evil werewolf, and was executed on Halloween. Now, while he's commonly described as a werewolf cannibal serial killer executed for an array of horribly lurid crimes, it is important to note that he admitted to said lurid crimes under torture, and his confession included practicing black magic since he was 12, turning into a wolf using a magic belt, and boning a succubus, all of which seem rather unlikely. Between that and the records of the actual investigation being sparse to non-existent, we literally have no idea if he actually did anything wrong. His daughter and mistress were also executed for his alleged crimes, so that's pleasant to think about. Today's
Wait a minute, what?
sparse to non-existent, we literally have no idea if he actually did anything wrong. His daughter and mistress were also executed for his alleged crimes, so that's pleasant to think about.
His daughter got executed for his crime? God, those times were really rosy, weren't they? Ugh, man, look at that. Look at the whole sentence, right? Everything about the, all that. Somebody, if a policeman wrote the report of that, everything about that is wrong. Everything is fictional. Like, it doesn't even make sense to anybody who's reading now. Like, anybody read that report of a, police report, everything in that would be fictional and just bullshit, basically. How does that time even make sense? Like, people walk around, created a police report like that, basically tried people with this kind of a claims, which is just completely fictional. That's just some fucked up times, man.
Today's hot take. The witch hunts were bad, actually. Surprisingly, this era also saw a few self-proclaimed werewolves. In the late 1500s, northeastern Italy had the Benandanti, who claimed to be good werewolves who fought witches. Instead of physically transforming, they turned into animals in their dreams and traveled in spirit form to fight witches, protect harvests, and occasionally travel into hell to bring back supplies that were stolen by demons. This was dope as hell, so obviously the witch hunters were very suspicious.
So these people go to their sleep, and from their sleep, from the dream, they fight all this. So these are basically just current day, imaginary peoples, I guess. How those kids, geeks, basically just imagine themselves to be superhero. These are these people. Oh, we are definitely werewolves.
But since the Benandanti were very insistent that they were warriors of God and fighting the real bad witches, this legitimately seems to have thrown the witch hunters off their game enough that they mostly just dismissed them as harmless. Even kind of annoying, since the Benandanti would regularly accuse other people of being evil witches they'd fought in their dreams. A few decades after the Benandanti faded out of focus, an 80-something man in Jürgensburg, Sweden, claimed before a judge to have been the same kind of heroic werewolf, serving as a warrior of God and battling witches in his dreams. The judge was less interested in his werewolf thing and more interested in how he hadn't been going to church regularly and had been practicing folk healing for the locals, so the dude was flogged a little and banished for life. Obviously a completely just and proportionate response. Thankfully, the whole witch hunting thing gradually wound down during the 1700s, but the effect it had on the popular image of werewolves was severe. Arguments over heresy aside, werewolves were now characterized as completely in control of and responsible for their transformation, gaining their wolf form through deals with the devil and being fundamentally evil and corrupt. This era did also have the hidden undercurrent of the wolf warriors of God thing, but they were pretty severely overshadowed by the satanic satanic devil werewolf version. Werewolves in this era were thought to transform either through trinkets like fur belts or wolf skins, or through illusions that just made them look like wolves. And that's where werewolf lore stayed until 1897 when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. Now we all remember Dracula, archetypical vampire, classic gothic horror, there's a cowboy in it, all that good stuff. But while Dracula is a vampire, there's plenty of werewolf stuff in his book. Dracula says outright that werewolf legends were inspired by him and his family, and the suspicious peasants Jonathan Harker keeps brushing off call Dracula something like Vilkolak, which Jonathan says means either werewolf or vampire interchangeably, but actually just means werewolf. Essentially, while Dracula is a vampire, I'd argue he's even the vampire, functionally speaking, Dracula is also a werewolf. It's like he's a point of convergence that lets some traits bleed over from one archetype to another. He can transform into a wolf at night and at noon, and he also controls wolves, though they seem to find him fundamentally wrong and very unnerving. The moon is also prominently referenced several times in the book as having some kind of connection to his powers, although that might just be gothic horror flavor text, it's a little hard to tell. On that note, you may have noticed that the moon has not factored into any of the historical werewolves we've dealt with till now. And there's been another popular modern werewolf trope conspicuously absent: the idea of lycanthropy.
Yeah, like I said, moon thing is just, I think is that like people act crazy when they see full moon, lunatics basically. That, and moon is opposite of the sun, and sun is the daylight, which is kind of a positive light. So when you see a moon, that I guess it's a nighttime. So darkness, lunatic, all these things got mixed up, and there you go. His power is from the moon. Okay.
Is a transmissible ailment. Cursed or not, none of the werewolves we've talked about so far have been contagious. But after Dracula and his charming habit of cursing people by biting them, that changes. In 1935, we get Werewolf of London, the first surviving Hollywood movie to feature a werewolf, in which the protagonist is bitten by a werewolf and over the 3 nights of the full moon transforms into a surprisingly dapper wolfman that, despite his best efforts, murders uncontrollably until he's shot and killed by a policeman in the finale. This theme pops up again in 1941's The Wolfman, the movie that really solidified the modern image of a werewolf. Another one transformed by bite, affected by the full moon, and this time vulnerable to silver, another new addition to the lore courtesy of Hollywood. These movies also feature humanoid werewolves rather than full transformations into quadrupedal wolves, possibly for special effects practicality reasons. After The Wolfman, werewolves got locked into pop culture as tragic, cursed monsters, transforming by the full moon into wolfman hybrids and functionally unstoppable except by silver. A trait which, fun fact, was given some retroactive legitimacy in the 1940s when French author Henri Porat wrote a somewhat fictionalized retelling of a real historical thing that happened in 1764. A series of deadly animal attacks terrorized the French province of Gevaudan. Now, what most likely happened was that there were several wolves or wolf-coyote hybrids or other canine critters in the area. They were hungry, they occasionally attacked, and they were gradually whittled down by hunters until the last one was killed in 1767. What people thought was happening was that there was one unkillable Beast of Gevaudan they kept hunting and killing, and it kept coming back for more. Witnesses also insisted it was like a wolf, but not a wolf, which, real talk, is one of my favorite horror tropes. I love it when the only way people can describe something is by listing the familiar things it's not. Anyway, the Beast was finally killed in 1767.
Oh yeah, definitely. I love that part too. Every time there is somebody talk about beast that has some similarity to certain animals or similarity to many animals, but not completely. Like it's completely something different. That's always fun. Like, that's chupacabra, where people, describes that it kind of is like some kind of a dog or a hound, but it's not. It has a big mouth and big snout type of thing. But yeah, I always love that mysterious because, you can't picture it, right? The way people describe it, you have to actually try to picture it, but it's hard to picture it. And it has a mysterious, feeling towards it.
By a local hunter, Jean Chastel, using what were, by all accounts, perfectly normal bullets and a perfectly normal gun. Well, Porat's version is a bit more spiced up than that. Porat attributed Chastel's final victory over the beast to silver medallions of the Virgin Mary that he melted down into silver bullets with which to finally slay the creature. Since he was writing this in 1946 and The Wolfman had come out in 1941, this definitely didn't originate the idea of werewolves being vulnerable to silver bullets, but it certainly helped reinforce it and add a veneer of legitimacy to the idea by giving it some retroactive historical clout. Now, before we get fully into the modern werewolf, there's one very important facet of their characterization that we have completely neglected, namely actual wolves. The pop culture interpretation of the werewolf is naturally going to heavily rely on the pop culture opinion of wolves in general, and until fairly recently, that opinion was not good. There's been a handful of heroic wolves in folklore. The she-wolf that raised Rome's founders Romulus and Remus is probably the most well-known example, but for the most part, wolves in folklore are bad news. Wolves in sheep's clothing, the boy who cried wolf, the big bad wolf, Aesop's fables about shepherds trusting wolves, wolves, wolf was practically fable shorthand for villain. When English colonists first came to the Americas, wolves had
It's not that hard to imagine. I mean, throughout the history, humans have been constantly been plagued by wolves, right? When humans were evolving, basically, until humans got the tools to fight back, against the wolves, and slowly started to, domesticate them. And there you go. We have dogs now. So wolves have been our enemies for a long, long time. So it's natural to, think that people created all these mythologies and stories where wolves are basically the enemy.
been extinct in England for over a century, but were alive and well in North America. And much like the other native inhabitants of the continent, the colonists wanted them gone. Wolves were scary, and for those new settlers, they also presented a broader threat, not because they were attacking them, but because they attacked their livestock, which was usually big, dumb, slow, and already caged for their convenience. With starvation already a very real threat for the colonists in those early years, this immediately put wolves pretty high on their shit list and inspired the first of many extermination campaigns, which are exactly as bad as they sound. See, back in ye olden times, Joe Colonizer wasn't exactly familiar with the concept of a trophic cascade and assumed most problems were simple and self-contained and could be easily solved by simply killing everything involved. Until the early 1900s, the actual stated goal of this push was to drive wolves to extinction. Now the fact is, wolves are not really all that dangerous to humans most of the time. Wolves basically don't attack humans unless they're sick or starving, or they've been habituated to lose their wariness of humans, and wolf packs usually top out around 8 members, most of them not even adults. But if there's one thing we know about horror, it's that humans fear the unknown, and after those first few extermination campaigns, wolf encounters were rare enough that they were almost completely unknown to your average Joe Colonizer, both because their numbers were dropping and because wolves were hiding from humans more. And now that wolves were more elusive, they were more unknown, and thus way scarier. In the 17 and 1800s, stories about wolf attacks got exponentially more sensationalized. Wolves weren't just hungry and dangerous, they were also morally evil and actively treacherous somehow. Stories of wolf attacks wouldn't just involve dozens of wolves, but
I mean, yeah, that is kind of true. The unknown, humans fear that the most. I mean, imagine if you encounter a bear, a normal bear, right? I don't know, black bear, brown bear, whatever. And then you encounter a polar bear. I bet you'd be more scared with polar bear than you'd be with the bear. Because bear, you would have seen that somewhere, maybe a zoo somewhere, I guess. There's a chance you saw a bear somewhere. Polar bear, you never saw that. Come on, what are the chances you ever saw polar bear in real life? So maybe polar bear would scare you the most, a white looking bear, they're like, what the fuck? Because you never seen it, it's kind of like an unknown element to it. So humans fear unknown the most. That's why human fears dark, because you don't know what the fuck is inside the dark. It could be nothing, but it could be anything.
massive packs of hundreds of starving creatures all hell-bent on hunting down innocent mothers and children in the snow. Some contemporary natural histories even insisted that wolves reproduced unnaturally quickly and only constantly murdering them was keeping their numbers down. This frankly ridiculous swath of misinformation was finally undercut ever so gently in 1944 when American wildlife biologist Adolph Murray decided to actually try studying the darn things in the wild. He found that wolves don't see humans as prey and actively avoid them whenever possible, that wolf packs usually stay small because they're too territorial to form large groups, and most importantly, that wolves are actually good for prey populations in the wild by keeping their numbers manageable, preventing overgrazing and subsequent starvation from the environmental damage. This didn't reverse the wolf's bad rep overnight, but it definitely flipped the narrative. By 1973, the Endangered Species Act declared that maybe genociding an entire species just because we don't like them is bad, actually, and introduced actual legal protections for wolf populations that had been whittled down to almost nothing. This decision—
Every single colonizer like, huh? What you just said? It's bad? We didn't thought of that.
Was not unilaterally popular because 400 years plus of bad press doesn't just disappear overnight and some people really like shooting wolves, but it was a good step. This also led to a preliminary look into how wolves socialize, leading to the whole alpha wolf concept, which was, fun fact, misleading enough that the same researcher who popularized it later disowned it, because the idea that some wolves were alphas implied a strength-based dominance hierarchy and some kind of fundamental alpha trait that made some wolves better than others, where in actuality the observed pack alpha wolves were literally just the parents of the rest of their pack, in charge not because they were powerful and dominant, but because they were mom and dad. Then in 1995, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone, giving them a protected area.
Man, what does it say about us that we see certain, apparently a power figure and think, oh, that must be the dominant alpha wolf. It's just by strength and dominance. And the wolf's like, dude, we are the parents. What the fuck are you talking about? We're trying to take care of our kids. We are the parents. Of course, we're in charge.
area to repopulate and avoid getting shot in, and by all accounts, that's going really well. Now, obviously, wolves aren't, harmless. They're wild animals, they're predators that hunt to survive, and those teeth are not just for decoration. But now that they're actually being studied, they're not unknown horror monsters either. And the shift in the pop culture attitude towards wolves has been mirrored in a shift in werewolf characterization. Early Hollywood werewolves were compassionate, tragic humans overwhelmed by a monstrous, mindless beast, driven to murder by uncontrollable animal instincts, mirroring the popular attitude towards wolves at the time. Modern werewolves usually still have an element of that beast within concept, but not always. Some werewolves retain the historical concept that their minds never change when they transform and they're still fully human on the inside, only physically changing. In others, the beast thing doesn't do much to affect their behavior, but will play into a usually outdated model of wolf social hierarchies. Pack loyalty, alpha wolves, lone wolves, all that good stuff. The idea that wolves are inherently evil has withered away, and as a result, the wolf side of the werewolf is losing that implication too. They're still wild, but they're not necessarily villainous. The modern werewolf is a flexible beast. There's a solid 2,000 years of lore to draw on, but no universally accepted canon to be limited to, so when a writer wants to write a werewolf, they can pick and choose the traits they want to use. And what traits get used usually reflect what story they want to tell. The classic Hollywood horror werewolf was pretty popular for a few decades, an innocent human cursed with a horrific and painful transformation, trying very hard not to kill people once a month. And those werewolves were almost always basically mindless rage monsters when they transformed, strongly affected by the full moon. But the tragic monster version has been largely phased out more recently in favor of a less categorically antagonistic version. Many modern werewolves are in at least partial control of their actions when transformed and can shift at will, with the more emotionally volatile parts of the character leveraged for drama rather than tragedy. Despite that flexibility, there's a few traits that have become staples of the modern werewolf. Silver bullets, the full moon, bite-based curse transmissions, some degree of animalistic or feral behavior. But even then, no two werewolf stories handle them quite the same way. Some stories stay pretty close to the middle of the bell curve, with werewolves that change under the full moon into wolf-man hybrids and shrug off anything south of a silver bullet. Underworld, Van Helsing, and about a million others play into this version, but plenty of stories get creative with the concept, like Wolfwalkers, a recent movie that combined three very different pieces of werewolf lore from three very different eras. First, the base concept is the Werewolves of Ossory, the Irish lineage of werewolves we mentioned. Second, the Witch Hunt era concept of the Benedonti and the Wolves of God, astrally projecting their dream selves in the shape of wolves rather than physically transforming into wolves. And finally, the post-Dracula idea of werewolves creating more werewolves by biting people. The Wolfwalkers, first shown in the movie, are an Irish mother and daughter protecting a forest from a nearby English town trying to clear-cut it. They manifest wolf.
Okay, werewolves biting other people and creating werewolves is a very rare thing, I think. People only, associate that with the vampires. Only vampire can do that. Werewolf usually either, they turn into werewolves spontaneously. That's the thing. But most famously, it's the moon thing, right? Because, full moon, and then werewolf is one of the most common thing there is. Now, obviously, werewolves are not like vampires. Vampires have really specific things to them that every other story kind of clings on to them. But werewolves are so flexible, there are so many different stories. I mean, it just branches out to anywhere. There's a high chance one werewolf story is completely different from the other one. Only similarity between them is just being a wolf factor. So werewolves is kind of flexible thing.
Forms when they sleep, an ability that turns out to be transmissible by bite. There's a few other features, magical healing abilities, controlling wolves, and a lot of the later stock werewolf tropes are noticeably absent, like the silver vulnerability or the moon factoring into anything. Like I said at the beginning, it's never been easy to nail down what should and shouldn't count as a werewolf, and that's continued into the modern day. Plenty of stories feature characters that could be argued as werewolves, but their power set might have almost nothing to do with their folkloric basis, which, as we've established, is itself a long-standing tradition. Almost none of these historical werewolves have anything in common with each other. I think this is mostly surprising because werewolves seem really basic on paper. It's kind of weird to think that such a simple monster concept has this much going on. And yeah, they're basic, but it's because they're basic that so much about them is flexible. The base etymology of the word werewolf is literally just man-wolf. Yeah. Beyond that, anything goes. What makes the man-wolf a man-wolf? What connects the man and wolf? Is it a divine punishment, a magical disease, a bond with the changing face of the moon, an artifact infused with wolfness, a simple magical quirk of the bloodline? How do the man and the wolf interact? Are they at odds? In sync? At war? Is the man lost in the wolf? Is the wolf just another side of the man? Is the wolf the man's shadow? Is the wolf the man's freedom? The nature of the werewolf is defined by their duality, but what exactly that duality means is completely up to the storyteller. And that is why werewolves are objectively cooler and more interesting than vampires. Yeah, I said it. It's about time someone did. Hope you got your
Yeah, I mean, it could be the Hulk thing, right? Like, when something turns into werewolf, how much control they're in. right? How much the man is in the control, or whatever the werewolf, the thing has become. Who's in control of that? Like how Hulk is not in the control, right? Banner is not in the control of the Hulk, I think, most of the time. Something like that. So yeah, werewolf is pretty flexible. You know, werewolves, I guess, spread around in different stories, different places, I guess, mostly associated with the moon thing. But yeah. Is there anything? Oh, there you go. I had a whole bit in my notes about the Ulfidnar, aka wolf coats. Norse warriors that wore wolf skins and were described as the king's honor guard. Like the wolf was one of berserkers, aka bear shirts. Hope you are quite. Unfortunately, that's a bit of a stretch under the werewolf definition, and this video is already massive, so I had to cut it. I mean, yeah, werewolf, man, wolf. If to me, if someone just turns into a wolf, it's not a werewolf, because it's like a transformation into a normal wolf. It has to be a hybrid of man and wolf for me to be considered werewolf. Because in the end, this is all made up shit. None of this is real. All of this is made up shit. So you have to draw the line somewhere. It's called werewolf, man wolf. So something has to resemble that. Not just somebody transform into a wolf, but who looks like a hybrid of man and wolf. Some kind of a beast type of thing at least. Prepare to die. Another fun fact, a commonly cited piece of werewolf lore is the Wolver, described by folklorist Jesse Saxby as a benevolent bipedal wolf-headed humanoid from Shetland fairy lore. Okay. Looks like they're just one problem, they don't exist. Like what other exist? Come on, none of them exist. Like they don't exist more than regular werewolves don't exist. The story itself is fake. Oh, okay, in that sense. The story doesn't exist. You know what? I love like they don't exist more than a regular werewolves don't exist. I mean, the story itself is fake. Hey, you know what I mean. Nasty weather. The Shetland Museum website has a whole article about how people keep asking them for Wolver lore, and there literally isn't any. I guess somebody just made it up, and there is no background to it. There is not even a story to it, because origin is not there. Jessie Saxby had a very vivid imagination. She didn't like the idea that Wolver's whole derives from Alf fairy. She wanted something more dramatic, so she invented the entire fictitious creature, the Wolver. Yeah, yeah. People have vivid imagination, why not? There is no Shetland Wolver tradition older than 1930. So that's fun. You can see why it takes me so long to research these things. Yeah, Dev, this is a half-an-hour video. This misinformation is thick on the ground, and it sometimes has a pretty impressive looking pedigree. Seriously, man, I love this channel for a shit like this. She's talking about mythologies and things that is not real. But origin, she's talking about the history of the origin, where things comes from. So she has to fact check that. Like she really has to make sure that all the time back, like centuries past. Am I sure that this existed? So she goes through all the detail, takes her time into that to make sure that it is fucking accurate. Blue does the same thing in the history. I love this channel for that, because I don't think there's any channel who puts this much effort into being accurate in their research, I guess. The original cut of this video had a segment on Twilight. I cut it as a form of self-care. You're all welcome. Yeah, seriously. Twilight, we don't need that shit. Well, don't go around tonight. Did you know the Twilight werewolves aren't werewolves? You don't have to say that. I mean, Twilight isn't much of anything. While check the wiki, the lore is nuts. I mean, come on. Twilight is mostly just drama, I guess. Well, it's bound to take you. Alright, there you go. That was fucking awesome. Halloween special, werewolves. Yeah, I mean, werewolves is a fucking awesome concept as a whole, and it is so flexible. People can do lots of things with it, even though recently people are not doing much with it. Not with vampire too, as I can think of it. Recently, there hasn't been any major movies with the vampires or werewolves. I guess that will come back in the future. It will return as a cycle. right? Suddenly there would be so many werewolves and vampire movies, I guess. And weirdly, vampires and werewolves goes together. Whenever a vampire is introduced around the corner, there is some werewolf stories too. I guess that's because of Dracula, how she said that Dracula blurred the line between vampire and werewolves. That could be the case. Alright people, if you like my reaction, don't forget to like, subscribe. Check out the reaction, there's a link in the description. Check out the cast of place, and yeah, I'll see you next time.